A huge win for common sense this week as the UK bans puberty blockers for children under 18. Maybe we should be thinking about doing the same thing here, but elsewhere in the West, there are still growing instances of gender ideology causing concern. Now, a great friend of this show, you'll remember him, he's been on here many times, Michael Shellenberger. He's the same journalist who exposed much of the climate hoax, who's brought us the Twitter files, and has now exposed the previously secret meetings of the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. That's WPATH, or WPATH, if you like. And what they reveal about the West's approach to gender healthcare is absolutely shocking. Joining us now is Michael Shellenberger. Michael, always great to see you. Hope you're well over there in the States. The work you've done on this is groundbreaking. It's gone all around the world this week. Tell us about it and how you came to expose these files, and more importantly, what is in there that is so disturbing.
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me on. It's a dark topic. This is the organization. It's called WPATH, and it's the so-called Transgender Medical Association that all of the major medical associations in the world rely on. And what their internal files show is that the people in this organization know that they are not getting so-called informed consent from kids and parents to life-altering medical procedures that will result in sterilization, the loss of sexual function, and perhaps even worse, cancer and death. We see kids as young as 10, 14, 13-year-olds with developmental delays discussed as potential patients to receive puberty blockers, as well as cross-sex hormones and surgeries. We see people with schizophrenia who are homeless discussed as candidates for surgery. We see people talking about giving drugs and surgeries to people with developmental delays, but also with dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. So what we're seeing is a really shocking case of medical mistreatment. I mean, it's definitely one of the worst in history. It might be the worst, of the last couple hundred years, honestly. When you look at sterilization, lobotomies, these are irreversible decisions being performed on a lot of times young people or vulnerable adults that have highly treatable psychiatric disorders like anxiety or autism spectrum, or they're just gay or lesbian kids or adults. But then you also have people with more serious mental illness. In both cases, these are totally inappropriate medical mistreatments. It's quite shocking to read because they have been claiming that this is based on science and good medicine, but they themselves acknowledge when you read these files, and there's also a video I should point out, they themselves acknowledge that they really don't know what they're doing. They're sort of making it up as they go along and sort of giving each other advice in a sort of chat room environment. It's really awful stuff to read, and it really couldn't come to an end any sooner.
Let's have a quick look. Here we go.
I think now that I follow a lot of kids into their mid-20s, I'm always like, oh, the dog isn't doing it for you, right? Yeah, they're like, no, I just found this, wonderful partner, and now we're kids, and da-da-da.
So they're discussing the dog ain't going to do it for you. The fact that a lot of these young, confused kids having these treatments end up with all sorts of lifelong consequences, sexual function issues, infertility. And in that instance, they're talking about patients who want to have children and they find they can't. And there was such a callousness to how casually that was discussed, Michael.
Yeah, and you really see the way that ideology is driving this. So in that same conversation, there's a point where they say, yeah, we really don't know how to explain to 14-year-olds that they won't be able to have kids in the future. They may lose sexual function. So gosh, that's something we need to figure out how to do. Well, no, the answer is stop performing these gruesome medical experiments on children. 14-year-olds can't possibly understand that they may want to have kids, in their 20s and 30s. So that's the right response, is to go, yeah, we don't know how to explain it to kids. That means that they're too young to be doing these procedures on. And yet they were sort of planning ahead, being like, oh, yeah, it's this big mystery. We don't know how to deal with this problem. These are not responsible people. These are dogmatists that are in the grip of an ideology, of a pseudoscientific ideology. They think that there's multiple sexes and that you can change somebody's biological sex through medicine. That's witchcraft. That's not modern science or medicine.
James.
And Michael, I mean, this is one of those things, you mentioned other previous things we look back historically as monstrosities in the medical community. And this is what happens when ideology gets confused with science. But, some of the other things that were involved in these files are really disturbing. I mean, we're talking about very powerful hormones here, and we're talking about, potential even links to things like cancers and so on, to young people that would never have gotten them because they have apparently been treated with very strong hormones, which doctors don't even fully understand the effects and how these powerful things that, get released in our bodies during a very critical stage of our life work, and the things that they do to our reproductive and other systems.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, there's already a response by an advocate of this so-called gender medicine where they claim that, oh, really, there's no evidence that testosterone would have contributed to these tumors on a female's liver that's described in the files. Well, in fact, we went and looked at it, and in fact, there are a large number of patient testimonies about testosterone causing liver tumors. We also see discussions of death from the use of these really radical drugs. And in fact, it turned out in that particular case of the liver cancer that the females' livers are more susceptible to the threat of testosterone because the livers of women are different. The differences.
Go figure.
The differences between men and women are not merely superficial. It's all the way down to our core physical cellular organs, our genetics. And so you're dealing with really a pseudoscientific cult. I think that's the only accurate way to describe it. That's performing what is the equivalent of witchcraft on children. And look, our societies tolerate a lot of strange beliefs. People are welcome to have strange beliefs. They must not be allowed to perform these dangerous and irreversible and often deadly experiments on the bodies of children, adolescents, and vulnerable adults. They've got to come to an end.
And Michael, just tell us again how WPATH, WPATH, or whatever they call themselves. The problem to me is not so much that they are so clearly, struggling in the dark, but other people cite them as the experts. So you have other doctors, the medicines, teachers, psychiatrists, all sorts of people then going, well, hang on, here are the experts. And the experts are saying this. But what you've done, Michael Shellenberger, is you've exposed that the experts ain't experts when it comes to lots of the detail. Is that the problem?
Yeah, it really is. And you mentioned at the beginning of this that the British National Health Service last week announced that it would be stopping all puberty blockers in its hospitals. The Times of London, which is a center-left newspaper, came out and said that the ban on puberty blockers should be even bigger. It should go across the entire country because they're worried that they'll still be prescribed in private clinics. Also the Times of London called this quack medicine. So you finally now see some responsible journalism. But I would also note, just in answer to your question, the Times of London pointed to WPATH as the group that was effectively allowed to whitewash and provide cover for the British medical authorities and other groups. Certainly, I mentioned the American Medical Association, the Endocrine Society, the American Academy of Pediatrics, all of them pointing to the WPATH as though it were some scientific or reliable medical body. It's not. It's basically, it's a completely fringe pseudoscientific cult organization that has presented itself and used very slick marketing to portray itself as an organization committed to patient health and the best available science, but it's not. It's absolute quackery, and really shame on all the institutions that fell for this. They can't distance themselves from WPATH faster. They need to distance themselves from it. And then there's going to need to be a reckoning, because a lot of kids, thousands of children, adolescents, and vulnerable adults around the Western world were damaged by WPATH. I think it's going to take a lot of lawsuits in the United States. A bunch of states have already banned this unethical medical practices, but we need to see national action. We've called on President Biden to put an end to this. I think we're going to see very quickly an unraveling of the entire gender pseudoscience and medical mistreatment epidemic that we've had over the last few years. I think it will happen very quickly now.
Well, it's happening quickly in the UK. Scandinavia's reviewed these practices. You mentioned the bans in parts of North America, but in Australia, we are blindly following this gender-affirming model. There is no reviews of these practices or any harms they may be causing. And some of the quackery or junk science that we keep hearing about when people defend gender-affirming care is, well, if we don't do this, then we're going to have a mass number of suicides. The confused kids who are getting this treatment would be at risk of self-harm if we don't give them hormone puberty blockers or double mastectomies. What's your response to that? Is there any actual evidence that backs up those claims about the threats of suicide?
Well, not only is there no evidence that supports those claims, there never was any evidence that supports those claims, and yet those were claims that were repeated by these prestigious medical organizations for years. What's more, we now know there was a study done in the last couple of years that showed that males that attempted sex change operations, and of course it's a misnomer since you cannot change your sex, that those individuals had a higher rate of suicide than those who did not go through with the surgeries. I think it's important for people to be reminded of something. If you, as a child or adolescent or adult, tell a therapist or a doctor that you're suicidal, they have a moral and ethical and I believe legal obligation to hospitalize you and require that you get psychiatric help. We don't let people threaten suicide. If we think they're at risk of suicide, then we actually require hospitalization because we don't allow people to be a threat to themselves or others. So the idea that there were people demanding medical treatments and that if they didn't get them, they would commit suicide. The fact that this was allowed to go on for years is really quite shocking. It's just one of the many shocking elements of this entire story, which we're still getting to the bottom of. It all rests on fundamentally a pseudoscientific idea that there's more than two sexes and that you can change your sex. From there, you get all sorts of really grotesque, psychologically manipulative, and in some cases, I just have to say, psychopathological behaviors and I think motivations behind the people that are both promoting these fake treatments, these harmful experiments, and the people performing them. I don't know how you go and do this to children and vulnerable adults while having much of a conscience or much of a reasoning brain. I just think there's something really wrong with the people that have been doing this, and I think they need to be held to account for their behavior.